Today's scripture reading comes from Daniel chapter 2, verses 20 to 23. Then Daniel praised the God of the heaven and said, "Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He sets up kings and deposes them. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in the darkness, and light dwells within him. I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and power. You have made known to me what we asked of you. You have made known to us the dream of the king."
Thank you, Finley. Always a pleasure to be at Albury. I've told you this story before. My wife knows where this story's going. So soon after we were married, and late at night time, you're sort of sitting there, you're lying in bed, you're sort of asleep, but you're still answering questions. And Amanda says to me, she asked me a question. We're living in New Zealand at this point. We also have a marriage that's Kiwi and an Australian. And she says, "Where do you want to retire?" And in my day's sleep, I said, "Albury Wodonga." And she sat bolt upright in the middle of the night and goes, "What is that?" I think she's expecting Sunshine Coast or Port Macquarie or somewhere a little more exotic. But Albury Wodonga, you get to live here, and it's magic because you've got the snow just out there, your inland just out there, you've got the Murray River just here. I grew up in Mildura further down where we used the water you'd already used. And you've got the river, you've got everything. You've got Sydney just there, you've got Melbourne just there, and you've got an amazing congregation of people who are Christ people here in Albury. And Amanda said to me this morning, she goes, "They've got a wonderful church." And she said, "I like Albury." So there you go. So it's always a pleasure to be in Albury for a whole lot of reasons. But I always enjoy when I stand here and look at this congregation. Why? Because you've got a mix of ages, and Paul says, the wisdom of years, the enthusiasm of youth. You've got a mixture of cultures, and the church exists to show the wider world what happens when there's a new kingdom culture where it's not about Greek or Jew or free or slave, where it's about together we form a new community. And as I look around and see all the cultures that make this church their home, I think what a wonderful little picture of heaven. The other thing I like about your church is your library. I like it when I see a church that takes its library really seriously. And I always have a little nosy around your library. And is April the library lady? Because the last few times that I've preached in Albury, I've always given you a volume of the Angel Set Australia, where we're up to. And last time I caught you up, but April already bought them. You'd been at a women's retreat the very same day that I was preaching here, and you already bought the first lot. And so I've grabbed the next three that I thought you might not have since I preached here. But April, I see them already on display in your library. But I do know that, April, you put them to good use with a second set, whether that's for the school or whether that's for however you're going to use them. So that's the next three that you've already got, but I thought I'd give you anyway. But April, you don't have this one in your library, because this one only got launched at the Executive a few weeks ago. It's actually stories of different brands. So it's got Colgate, it's got Johnson & Johnson, it's got all these stories that my mum used to tell my brothers and sister and I as we were kids. She'd tell us the stories of all these brands and what values they link to. So Colgate, if I see the Colgate brand, I think give generously. If I see Arnott's, live with integrity. If I see Cadbury, treat people with dignity. My mum drummed these in. And Sean, who's with us today, Sean, we did this in our Sabbath school. We went through all the brands and all the lessons. Now they're in a book here. So this book goes to your library, and I grabbed a second one because I knew you used it for a second one. So April, if you want to grab these, and I think you have one of the best church libraries going anywhere, so well done. But as Letitia mentioned, since I've last been in Albury, when I say change jobs, so I like my old job a lot. My old job, pastor to pastors, and so I've kept that job, half of it. And Lindell Peterson, whose uncle is somewhere sitting, there he is. She's now full-time ministerial, and I'm the associate. But because I said yes to a different job. And if I make this clicker click, do I point it up this way to make it click? Do you know what? Probably a good idea if I turn it on to make it click. So, at our general conference, there's what they call 6 mission centres. One of them is the Centre for Buddhist Relations. I'm not that one. The next one is, but they do amazing things. And Campsay, who used to be a pastor here in Australia, some of you know Campsay. Campsay leads that. The Centre for South Asian Religion, there's another centre. There's a Centre for Adventist Jewish Relations. There's a Centre for Muslim Relations. There's a Centre for Urban Mission, and there's a Centre for Secular and Post-Christian Mission. So out of those 6, if you had to guess which one is the centre that I lead, which one's going to be? The last one, yes. Secular Post-Christian Mission, because you remember I've come here and talked all about consumerism and how consumerism and consumer culture. So that's what I do for a job. What's the challenge of this job? It's resourcing church leaders, it's thinking through strategies, because reality is Australia, New Zealand, particularly Europe, particularly UK, and I've just come back from a couple of weeks in Helsinki talking to pastors in the Nordic area and then in the UK. Not just the Adventist church, but Christianity, people are less and less identifying with Christianity. It's going down quite quickly. What's that mean? What's that do? Intriguingly, in Australia, it's not that people are becoming less spiritual. They're still spiritual. It's an individualized spirituality. It's individualized, it's syncretized, it's choose what you want, make the God that works for me spirituality. This is my truth. It's a different kind of spirituality. What's that mean for a church? Well, that's what I do for a job, working through what's it look like. And I really do believe that the Adventist church has a message that this culture desperately needs to hear. A beautiful picture of God where people have a picture of God that's often distorted and a God that's often a cruel, arbitrary, vengeful God is what Ellen White writes in Steps to Christ. She writes, instead, the devil wants to paint that picture, instead we have a beautiful picture of God. And I think being that beautiful picture of God and modelling that beautiful picture of God, what's it mean to be a group that celebrates for a whole day each week, that recalibrates around growing and serving, connecting, sharing, worshipping? What's it look like to be a church that emphasises God with us? So I think there's a lot of what our culture needs to be part of that grows out of our Adventist message. And today we're going to talk a little bit about that. So, you and I live in the most individualized culture in the history of the planet. What do we mean by that? Well, some of you who have experienced other cultures around the planet have a more community-focused orientation, but not Western consumer culture. What happens in our culture? Well, because we think time equals money and money equals things and things equal happiness, we think anything that takes my time, takes my money, takes my happiness. Tim Kasser, a psychologist, said that's just the grid we live in. It's just the pool we're swimming in. Whether we like it or not, without even thinking, we fit into this grid. We think that time equals money, money equals things equal happiness. So therefore, I will protect my time. And when someone asks me to serve, which is why I love seeing these guys who have said yes to being deacons, when someone says, serve in your church, if you're thinking through the consumer grid, you're thinking they're after my time. They're after my happiness, which is a strange way to think. And we don't often sit down and analyse that, but that's the grid we often process decisions through. If I say take time to spend with your neighbours, once again, it's that takes my happiness, which we know it doesn't when you think about it, but without even thinking, you and I live in that individualised culture. Maybe not in Albury, but wherever consumerism goes up, connectedness goes down. That's connectedness with one another. That's connectedness with God. Where consumerism goes up, connectedness goes down. Why? Well, a guy called Oliver James, not Jamie Oliver. Jamie Oliver's a chef and makes food. Oliver James is a sociologist who writes books about consumer culture. And he measures cultures on our planet and says, as we identify more with consumer values, we identify less with relational values because I start thinking of myself. And 3,000 times a day from your little phone, from your computer screen, from your television, from the back of the bus, from a magazine, you're told messages that think about you need more, or you need this, or you would be better if you looked like this or had that. If you just had this product and not that one, if you had this model and not that one, if your skin was like this or your hair was like that, if your teeth were whiter, then you would be a better version of you. And you're told this message over and over and over. As Paul writes in Romans 12, verse 2, he says, he uses the word conform to the pattern of this world. And you and I can get conformed there pretty quick because there's some very clever advertisers who are there to convince you that you're one purchase away from being a better version of yourself. Consumerism isn't what I own, it's my commitment to what I don't own yet. And so therefore, I'm always chasing this next thing, what I don't own yet. And when I start putting my hope and desire in what I don't own yet, when I think the better transformed version of myself is what I don't own yet, then I spend my life thinking it's just out there. And sadly, in this sort of culture, I become more and more insular. I disengage from the bigger stories of my culture and my history and become thinking about me. In this culture, I want endless choice. Zygmunt Bauman, he passed away 2 years ago, but he was a Polish philosopher. And he writes about our culture. He's done a lot of analysis of how culture works. And he says there was a time when our culture was, he called it solid, where this is what we believed, this is who we were as people. And he says, says consumerism is what heats us up. He says, as consumerism heated our culture up, we became more liquid. And therefore, he said, we lived in a liquid culture where we didn't want those fixities of previous generations. This can be for good and for bad, where we didn't want these fixities of previous generations. Before he died, he said, our culture has turned into a gas, heated up by consumerism, but we don't want to be fixed. We don't want to be told what to do. Don't you tell me what to do. Don't you tell me what choices I have to make. Don't even tell me what gender I am. I will work this out myself. So therefore, we're in this gaseous culture that emphasizes my choice and my truth, and I will have my truth and you'll have your truth. What an interesting culture to be in. It's a culture of instant gratification. Don't wait, you get it now. It's a culture that thinks in sound bites. We don't want to listen for a long time anymore. We don't want to have to think too much. We don't want to have to delve in. We want a quick sound bite that summarizes it. We don't want a 5-day cricket game anymore. We want it all over in 20 overs, hey? Because we want stuff to happen quick. And we just want to take the consumable best of it because we don't want to have to go thinking too much. And our hope and desire is in things. So, here's the thing. You might start thinking, and I do because this is what I did my PhD study in. I blame consumerism for everything. I blame consumerism for family dysfunctions. I blame consumerism for marriage issues. I blame consumerism for society issues. Keeping in mind, there were issues before consumerism. There's always been an ism. And if we go right back, we find it right back in the Garden of Eden. It's selfishness. I want to be equal to God. I'm not going to take God at his word. And I can be this. And this has been playing out all the way along. So it's not as if there's something new we have to work through. There's always been what Paul says, a culture that drags us down, that conforms us to its culture. There's always been an empire that's giving its values and trying to say, live like this. Consumerism is just our current culture's iteration institutionalized selfishness. However, if you look at measures of selfishness, then our culture is growing on that one as it declines on connectedness. So, what's it look like to be a new community in our culture? If, as I said before, the church is called out to show the world what happens when a group of people live life with a different set of values. If, as Paul says, the church is the new community. If, as Paul writes, there's a different way of being human when all these empires are around us, when there's all these different values telling us what to do and what to think. There's a different way. As Jesus says, there's a different story to live out. In these empire stories of domination and control and power, there's a different way to be human. There's a way that serves more than gets served. There's a way that forgives rather than demands my rights. There's a way of what's it look like to forgive your enemies. What's it look like to be what Ellen White calls a loving and lovable Christian? What's that look like? And how do we live this new community's values in the middle of our culture? So, let's go back, let's wind back around 2,500 years, and you find a bunch of young guys living out a different story in the midst of the empire. Can you guess where we're up to? Daniel. What's it look like to go back and there you find Daniel and his friends, and they're dragged far away from home and they're living in Babylon. They have been given a different name. Let's take their Jewish names and let's give them a Babylon name. Let's educate them in Babylonian thinking. Let's put them in the Babylonian schools with the idea being we'll take these boys, the smartest, the brightest, the best looking, we'll turn them into Babylonian worldview so they can go back and rule for us. So here they are, far away from home, living in Babylon. What's Babylon? Good place, bad place? It's the culture that's all around them. Where do you first find Babylon in the Bible? Tower of Babel, of course. Genesis chapter 11. In the Tower of Babel. And what's going on there? If you read Genesis chapter 11, it's build us a tower so we can make a name for ourselves. If you read the narrative, it's basically talking about we're not going to trust God's word here anymore. Where God said, I'm not going to flood the world anymore. Well, we're not going to take him in his word in this. Let's build a big tower just in case, and we'll make a name for ourselves. Babylon has always been built on self. Where do you find Babylon again? Does anyone know where Babylon turns up again in Scripture? It turns up in Daniel. It turns up in Isaiah 47, and Isaiah talks about, hey, there's what happens when Babylon, the actual city, is destroyed. It turns up in Jeremiah. Jeremiah remarkably says, in chapter 49 of Jeremiah, he says, pray for Babylon. He says, pray for your captors, because in their welfare is your welfare. So he's saying, hey, pray for these people, when he's writing the exiles, pray for these people. Turns up in Habakkuk, when Habakkuk says, hey God, why are the bad people winning and the good people losing? And God answers, says, Habakkuk, I will send the Babylonians. And Habakkuk goes, that's even worse, not the Babylonians. And God says, even if it doesn't make sense to you, worship me anyway. And that's where Habakkuk says, hey, though there's no cattle in the stall, there's no figs on the tree, I'll worship God anyway. Jeremiah 29, by the way, I said 49. Jeremiah 29 is where it says, pray for your captors, pray for Babylon. Where do you find it after that? So it's through the Old Testament. Where do you find Babylon again? Does Babylon turn up in the New Testament? In Revelation. Revelation chapter 14, well, chapter 13 talks about Babylon, but chapter 14 talks about Babylon, chapter 15 talks about Babylon, because Babylon becomes a symbol of this empire, Babylon becomes a symbol of beasts that crush people. Babylon becomes a symbol of this whole different system of values. Babylon becomes a symbol of power and control. Babylon becomes a symbol in Revelation of any time the worship of God is taken and put on self. Religious system, political system, a spiritual system throughout history. But any time a kingdom that may have been for God has so lost its way, it's now focused on self. So the three angels in Revelation 14, the first angel says, give God worship because his hour of judgment has come. Give God worship because he's the creator, which has some connections to the Sabbath we sang about before. Give God worship because worship matters. The second angel, Babylon has fallen, it's fallen. This great empire that looked like it was set, this great empire that takes God out of the equation, this great empire that takes the worship of God and puts it on self, that uses God in selfish ways to get power and control, systems of power and control. Anytime you see a church that uses power and control to hurt people, it's missed the point. Anytime, anywhere, and sadly you see churches sometimes that will dress up theology, but really it's about power and control. Anytime the worship of God gets turned into power and control, anytime a church demeans people in the name of God, it's got the spirit of Babylon. But Babylon has fallen, come out of her, my people. It's saying this system doesn't stack up. What's the third angel say? The third angel gets more urgent. Talks about the mark of the beast. That's the exciting one, hey? Anyone who worships the beast in his image talks about the mark of the beast. And if we go back at the end of the previous chapter, the mark of the beast, the number is 666. So, if you're sitting there reading Revelation and you read that number, and you're a person who's reading Revelation, sitting back when John wrote the book of Revelation, you're going to think, I've heard this number before. And you're going to think of 1 Kings chapter 10, and you're going to think of a story about Solomon. And it's going to be Solomon who asked for wisdom, who lived life God's way, whose kingdom was a picture of how God worked. But Solomon, as he got more and more, as he accumulated, the Queen of Sheba comes to visit. And did Solomon give the Queen of Sheba a Bible study about how God has done all of this? What did he do? Says it's all about me. I'll show you all my things. Look how clever I am and look at all my stuff. And look at my empire. And if you read in verse chapter 11, or as you're reading the chapter 10 where it says the Queen of Sheba visits, and this is the part where Solomon's story changes. After this, Solomon's a different man. He's not honouring God anymore. But verse 14, the weight of the gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was, do you got a number there? 666 talents of gold. If you're reading Revelation as a first reader of Revelation, this number jumps out because you know this number. Because you know that this is the turning point for Solomon where it turns from giving glory to God to self. Now, April in our Sabbath school class this morning, and I was out in Russell and Shirley's class, great class, by the way. I was out in Russell and Shirley's class in the hall, and April said a really interesting thing. We're talking about selfishness, and she said selfishness, I don't want to misquote you, April, but you said selfishness is the spirit of Babylon. Is that what you said? Pretty something similar. And I agree. You and I are living in a world surrounded by selfishness. We can look at Babylon out there as a system, a religious political system, but the spirit of Babylon happens a lot closer to home. Paul writes, every day I need to die to self. Selfishness has always been the problem. And as I said, consumerism is just our culture's iteration of selfishness. You and I live in a world where we get those 3,000 messages say to focus on self. Yet Yet Jesus says there's a different community where you give your life away to find it. Paul says in Romans 12, become a living sacrifice. This is your act of worship. Become a living sacrifice. What's that look like to be a community that's a living sacrifice? Well, and I've been forgetting to click my slides. That's okay, because we can go through a few of these. Here's some tips from Daniel for living in Babylon, because Daniel and his friends have played this game before. Remember, you live for a different kingdom. So Daniel and his friends, you can take them away far from home and put them in the middle of Babylon. You can give them a Babylonian name. You can give them Babylonian education. But guess what? I belong somewhere else. My story is somewhere else. I'm going to look towards Jerusalem because I know that I'm living in this system, but this system doesn't have to live in me, because God lives richly in me, and I will be part of this system. As Jeremiah writes to the exiles, pray for Babylon. Did Daniel and his three friends thrive? It was a bit hard to get out. Did Daniel and his three friends thrive in Babylon? Yes, they did. But that didn't matter to them, whether they did so or not, whether you're in a lion's den or whether you're the second in government, didn't matter to Daniel. It did not matter. If he was successful in Babylon, great. If he wasn't successful, who cares? Because it's a different story anyway. If you're successful by our world's measure and standards, if somehow you've accumulated a lot, remember it belongs to God anyway. And whether you're at the bottom of the pile or the top of the pile, that's not the story. Significance is the story. There's a big difference between success and significance. Our world measures by success, by what I've accumulated on a monopoly board of life. Significance is what matters for eternity. Keeping in mind, you can win the game of Monopoly, and the next thing is it all goes back in the box. And one day you're going to be in a box. And all that game of Monopoly doesn't matter so much then. What matters is what you've invested into the kingdom. That's character and that's people. People are the treasure. So remember, you live for a bigger story. And when this world gives you its message that it's about now, you remember, no, it's about eternity. And when this world gives you a story, it's about you, you remember, no, I've given my life away for a different story. And sure, you might thrive in Babylon, or you might not, but it doesn't matter, because that's not the story. And Daniel and his friends remembered that they belong to a different system, a bigger story. So do you. You're the new community. You're a new way of being human. You're not about power and control, whether that be in your workplace, in your marriage, wherever you're living out your life. It's not about power and control. You're living a new way of being human, which is the Jesus way, which is giving life away to serve. Daniel purposed in his heart. So you get to the story, the famous story about the king's food, and here's all the food of Babylon. And you can read different reasons, theologians. Some will say, oh, it's because that food was offered to idols, and Daniel would have seen that as partaking in the worship of idols. Or some people say, no, because when you ate at someone's table, it's a symbol of taking their values, and Daniel and his friends didn't symbolically take the king's values. Some say it's a health decision, and they didn't want to. Do you know what? Whichever way. Maybe it was all three, I don't know. But whichever way, for whatever reason, Daniel's saying, this is where I draw the line. Babylonian name, Babylonian school, but this is an issue of worship. I belong to a different story, and it says Daniel purposed in his heart. Paul says he dies daily to self. You and I live in a kingdom with totally different values to the kingdom of God. What do you purpose in your heart? What do you decide matters and what you're living for? Daniel chapter 2:17, or you'll know the story of when the kings had the dream, and he's saying, away with all the magicians and astrologers and all the wise men, and that's going to include Daniel and his friends, and they're going, no, give us some time to pray about this. And they pray. I do like the song that says, though no one join me, still I would follow. That's nice. But guess what? You're designed to live in community. And it's always helpful when you have friends who are going to support and encourage and pray with you. And I enjoyed looking in your bulletin, I was looking at the bulletin online, and seeing that you've got prayer groups where it's saying get together in prayer groups, and you've got, because that matters. If there's a time where though no one join me, still I will follow, great. But guess what? Wherever you've got Christian friends to pray with and pray for, wherever you have a church family that you pray with and pray for, you do that. Because this is not meant to be a solo thing. 86 times Paul talks about encouraging one another and praying for one another and caring for one another and all the one another's of Scripture. So, and I think it's wonderful you're doing a strategy afternoon and looking at what's working, what you're going to do better. But I really love the fact this church has an emphasis on prayer and praying together, because that really matters. And so if there's any commitment that you're going to make, if you're not one of those prayer groups, I know I'm going to run away and I'm not going to be here. Just do it. Just get in a prayer group and pray. Remember, it all belongs to God. 2:21. When the king says, Daniel, this is amazing, you revealed the dream. And guess what Daniel says? Wasn't me. There's a God in heaven, he told me. My clever mind, it already belongs to God. It's not about me. It's all from God. And sometimes we start thinking it is about us. It must have been our cleverness. It must have been something else. Oh, look how smart I am. Or look how good I am at something else. It's not even yours. It all belongs to God. My mum used to pray for us every night. I won't tell you the whole story. Russell mentioned in Sabbath school this morning. My mum used to pray for my brothers and I and my sister every night. Help Brendan to remember that life is not about him. He exists for your glory. And whether it's brainwashing or not, when you hear that sentence every night of your life, it goes into your head and you remember, it's not about you. You exist for God's glory. By the time we get to chapter 6, you have the story of Daniel in a lion's den. Now, I'm sure Daniel prayed often, but he certainly made particular times of prayer where he recalibrated, where he opened his window and prayed towards Jerusalem. Now, for Daniel, whatever happened, he decided that he lived for God's glory, and whether there was a threat of a lion's den or not, the decision was simple, because he'd already decided that he was going to recalibrate and he was going to focus on living for God regardless. And so if the outcome's this, who cares? He's already decided it. If the outcome's that, who cares? He's already decided it. And he recalibrated around the fact that he belonged to God and lived in a different story. The Sabbath is a great way to recalibrate. But making mini Sabbaths throughout our life, throughout every day, where you put in place heart-building habits, where you do those things that allow you to connect deeply with God, that matters. And so may you take that time to put in place whatever it's going to be that allows you to recalibrate and remember, because as Paul writes in Romans 12, we get conformed to the pattern of this world. The opposite of that in Romans 12 is transformed by the renewing of your mind. The Message paraphrase, and I usually don't deal in paraphrases, but the Message paraphrase of Romans 12 summarizes it really well. It says, in your ordinary everyday life, you're eating, you're sleeping, you're going to work and walking around life, place that before God as an offering. Embracing what he has done for you is the best you can do for him. And usually Peterson paraphrases saying, don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit in without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God, readily recognize what he wants from you, and unlike this culture around you that's always dragging you down to its level of immaturity, Christ brings out well-formed attitudes in you. Conform to the pattern of this world, transformed by a renewing of your mind to be a new community. Paul goes on in Romans 12 to talk about a community that's worshipping, that's serving, that's growing, connecting, sharing. So, Aubrey Church, may you be a worshipping, serving, growing, connecting picture of what it is to be Christ's new community. In a world surrounded by Babylon, may you model a different way of being human. In a world about power and control, may you serve and love and connect and share. And may the fruits of the Spirit permeate this community so this part of the world, Albury Wodonga, sees a group of people going, that's different. They're living for a different system. They're living a different story. May you calibrate. May you grow nearer and nearer to Christ. May you allow him to dwell richly in you. So Aubrey Church is a place that shines Jesus' story to this part. And so that Christ dwells richly in you and works in and through you. May you be a different story. May you be a new community.